Time to bring in our Monday afternoon panel of political strategists Grahame Morris and Bruce Hawker. A very good afternoon to both of you. Let me start on higher education. We heard Chris Pyne earlier arguing that he has given a fair bit of ground now, Grahame. They simply want the deregulation of universities alone dealt with this week. What do you think of the chances of that getting through, and how do you think the government's handled this whole issue?
Well, it still looks in big trouble, despite today's moves. Look, I was at a football game last night in Canberra with one of the Vice-Chancellors, and he was saying, Grahame, you know what the problem was? On day one, you had deregulation, which is a good idea, in the same document as cuts. And the cuts were always going to swamp any sort of benefits of the deregulation. He said, you know, it should have been split. Well, today you wake up and it has been split. But, you know, maybe it's too late. Just listening to the senators in the last few hours, they still have problems with it. I hope now that the opposition, or at least enough of the senators, the independents, will go with the government, because not only is deregulation, I think, not a bad idea so we don't have second-rate universities continuing in this country, but also attached to it are tens of thousands of people at the bottom sort of end of the socio-economic area who are going to benefit with these pathways to university. And that seems to me to be very, very good news. But David, you ask, you know, does it have a chance? Well, it's still breathing, but it sounds as if it's got an awful case of asthma.
You wouldn't
really
stake your house on it getting through. Grahame, it seems to me, as your point, if they'd done this a whole lot earlier and said, we're just going to do deregulation, and quite frankly, the funding cut is even less likely to get through than the deregulation, of course, but if we're just going to do deregulation, you would have had the Vice-Chancellors wholeheartedly on board, because they've always had the concern about the funding cut. You might have been able to encourage them to make public what they would charge for various course fees, and have some way of policing it as well, whether it's the ACCC or whatever, so they don't get too out of control.
Yeah, and that's right. Look, everyone's claiming everything's going to be $100,000 degrees. It's not. You know, they're sort of 80-90%, nowhere near that. Yeah, you'll get some that'll go up, but Vice-Chancellors would have had to have been very careful that they didn't price themselves out of the market. Otherwise, then the best and the brightest will go elsewhere. So they should.
Now, Bruce, I'm sure you're not a supporter of the deregulation issue here, but what do you think about the way this has been handled by the government? There have been a series of backdowns or measures to soften this package, whether it's the interest rate, whether it's restoring the funding for research, and now pushing out the funding cut for another day. Has this been a well-handled reform?
No, and it looks very underchorus. It looks like a rabble, really. The whole government, they look like the French army in their retreat from the Battle of Mons. You know, they just aren't. They announce something and then they run away from it, you know, within hours sometimes of actually making the announcement. They've gone from being hard men to being completely at the whim and the will of anybody that wants to criticise them. So I don't think this has gone down very well for Tony Abbott, Christopher Pyne, or anybody associated with the Liberal Party. It just is a perception now that they're running away from everything that they have stood for in the past. And I think that's a real problem for them. You know, and I think the whole Graham's analysis, I think, is pretty accurate. Once Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, no one can put it back together again, and I think that's their problem here. They're trying to put together an egg that's well and truly cracked. And I think they're better off walking away from it, frankly. Australians are very, very sharey about the prospect of paying more and more money for their children's higher education.
Well, I think that's right. That's right. We do have a sector here, though, that's very important, whether it's third or fourth largest export sector. A lot of jobs hang off it. Labor says it wants to do the right thing. Everyone seems to agree, though, Bruce, that the status quo isn't sustainable. Do you think Labor should come up with some way of helping this industry thrive and survive?
Well, it's not really their job at the moment to do that. I think they are in a position where they can say, well, you know, we had a system that we introduced, we're going to increase funding to higher education and certainly to school education, and now the current government's walking away from that. I don't think that they're under much pressure at the moment to come up with solutions to the government's problems. I think these are problems that the government's making. They failed to sell the big issue, which was, you know, that we need to, rein in spending. They talked about reining in spending, but then they didn't actually tell people how dramatically difficult it was going to be after the election to do that. And so people were rightly surprised and annoyed with the government when they went away and started breaking their commitments about all these things. So I don't think it's up to Labor to sort their problems out. I think it's up to them to go away and rethink the whole way in which they've addressed this problem from the outset. And I think it's going to be very hard now because we're going into another budget cycle within weeks.
There's a few other things I want to talk about just before we leave this issue, Grahame. Dealing with this crossbench in the Senate has always been pretty tricky for the government. I guess it's become even trickier now with Glenn Lazarus leaving PUP. Do you think the government's getting it right, though, when it comes to trying to herd 6 of the 8 crossbenches that it needs on anything it tries to do?
Well, David, I think they're tried, but you're right. We now have 8 different people. There are no 2 groupings in the Parliament, none. And you know, does it make it harder? Well, probably not, because they're all over the place anyway. But you know, nobody's ever dealt with 8 individual sort of parties in the Senate before, which is what we've got. And I think, you know, Christopher Pyne has bent over backwards, sideways, everywhere else. I'm not quite sure what else anyone expected him to do. I think he's tried. It's just that we have a recalcitrant sort of Senate. And even on Wednesday, I'd be surprised if he got 6.
Now, speaking of this Senate, Clive Palmer just in the last few hours has put out a statement following the defection of, or the departure of Glenn Lazarus to sit as an independent. He's considering, he says, joining the High Court action that the DLP are trying to get up against John Madigan, who left the DLP, now sits as an independent. Glenn Lazarus now will sit as an independent. So it's a threat, really, that he wants to take this, or could take this, to the High Court as to whether Glenn Lazarus should still sit in the Senate as an independent. He was elected as a Palmer United Party senator, as was Jackie Lambie. Both have now left. Will there be a legal leg to stand on here?
Oh, well, I hope he's got plenty of money, because I think he'd be wasting it, because, you know, our electoral system, believe it or not, says people get elected, not parties. So I'm just not quite sure what his case would be. But it could well be that Clive Palmer now becomes the most expensive executive assistant or personal assistant in the world, because he sort of has no role in the Senate anymore except to be personal assistant to Senator Wang,
who's got a lot more power than Clive.
So we've got a billionaire executive assistant. That's got to be a first.
On this issue, though, Bruce, I'm keen for your thoughts as well, because you can understand any party feeling aggrieved when a senator or indeed an MP jumps ship and sits as an independent or joins another party. They were elected under the banner of that party. But Graham's right, isn't he? I mean, you know, you can have whatever contract you want in place. The point is, our electoral system, they are elected under their name.
That's exactly right, and I don't know why the DLP is even bothering to run this case. I mean, I'd love to see their legal advice on it, but you know, it has been this way ever since the Westminster system got off the ground and parties started to appear. Members attach themselves to parties, but they aren't electing a party when voters are putting them into Parliament. They're electing the individual. That's as clear as day. So Clive's just engaging in some more grandstanding. If I was him, I'd be trying to make up to Lazarus rather than annoy him even more.
Yeah. Why then, though, just to this point, you know, tease out the other side of the argument, when a senator resigns the Senate altogether or dies, the party then is able to put in whoever they want, the next person on the ticket?
That's right. Well, and there have been instances in the past where people like Joe Bajolgi-Peterson have intervened, and when a Labor senator has died. It happened with Jim McAuliffe, I think it was, in Queensland in about 1975, and they replaced a stooge who was not really part of the party, and that created huge problems. It was one of the reasons why we had the rejection of supply. So that's because I think if it's the individual can leave the party, that's fine, and go and sit elsewhere. But if the person who replaces the individual is not from that party, then you're effectively saying, well, we're disregarding everything the electorate did when they elected that person back then and associated them with the party. It is a contradiction, yes, but it actually makes sense that you would do it that way with respect to an upper house position rather than someone who's being elected to an individual seat. In the upper house, they're on a list. In the lower house, they're in a seat.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone would want to go back to a whole statewide election every time a senator pulls the pin and re-elects someone new. Let me ask you both about metadata. Now, Grahame, the government wants a vote pretty soon on this in this sitting fortnight. There's been an important development this afternoon. Bill Shorten yesterday wrote to the Prime Minister seeking an exemption for journalists so that their metadata can't be accessed as readily as everybody else to protect their sources. And now the Prime Minister's written back and essentially agreed that to access the metadata of a journalist, you would need a warrant. Is that a sensible move? What's the grin for?
Oh, our poor sensitive little journalists. Oh, look, this is an ex-journalist. Am I exempt? What about journalist wives?
This is a good point.
What about journalist wives? What about somebody who is a blinking terrorist, sets up a blog and said, hey, I'm a journalist? And how are you going to determine who a journalist is? You know, surely it's not the members of the Clowns Union that the journalists have to join. I don't know. You know, is anyone who's got a blog, are they a journalist? You know, you could get... We all understand freedom of the press, and that's fine. But are you really saying that ASIO and everyone is listening to David Speers' conversation? What on earth for?
They can watch whenever they want. But this is a good point about who is and who isn't a journalist. I mean, plenty of journalists are easily identifiable. But
well, I come on your show once a week. Does that make me a sort of a media person?
As you rightly point out, though, there's bloggers, there's a lot of people who claim to be journalists who aren't necessarily.
Yeah. And what about their spouses? Are they in?
But do you acknowledge that investigating a cabinet leak, say for example, if it did have to do with national security or any other topic really, they should be readily able to access the metadata?
No, I don't. No, I don't. But I think any journalist, so-called journalist, who's writing a blog and who's really a terrorist, then I reckon ASIO and everybody else ought to be able to listen in and have a look at what on earth that lunatic is doing. Look, we all know what everyone's trying to do here. It cannot be on people's wit to make sure that fair income journalists are clean, but the lunatics, we'll listen to them.
It means coming up, Bruce, what do you think? It means coming up with a definition of what is a journalist.
Indeed. And some people parade as journalists right now, probably are paid as journalists, and I suspect they're not really. And as much as I would have liked to have seen the entire press gallery behind bars on certain occasions, I don't think that's a good idea. And I think the Prime Minister is now coming to that conclusion too. You know, the media, no matter how much we rail against it, has a critically important part to play in the democratic processes, and we have to be very careful in our dealings with them, or the government has to be, when it comes to accessing information that they have, because believe me, there'll be plenty of agencies out there who will want to get into the information being held by journalists in order to run their own agendas, and we've seen that in the past and we'll see it again. So I think it's a good move. I think the Parliamentary Council will be able to work out ways of defining what a genuine journalist is, and also there might be circumstances where even a genuine journalist has abused his or her position. There should be some catch-all provisions for that as well, but that will be very rare. Very rare.
Yeah, still get a warrant to access the data under what the Prime Minister's proposed. We'll see what they come up with. Bruce, Hawker, Grahame Morris, thank you very much. We'll see you again next week. Quick break, back with more on PM Agenda. Stay with us.